The Galactic Council believed it had erased humanity, a mere footnote in the annals of cosmic history, an anomaly corrected by the iron hand of exile. They were wrong. For a century, the Council's admirals scoffed at the notion of human survival, dismissing the lost species as another failed experiment in the grand design of the universe. But now, entire fleets vanish into the void. Worlds go dark, their distress calls met with only silence. And in the abyss where no light dares to shine, a shadow moves. A message ripples across the galactic core, a voice that sends tremors through the ancient halls of power. 800 years ago, you cast us into oblivion. You thought we would break. You thought we would die. Instead, we became something else. Something worse. We are humanity, and we have returned. The Galactic Council chamber was silent, an unnatural, suffocating quiet, the kind that signaled something far worse than war. They had convened in emergency session, every ruling species present, their holographic figures flickering over the circular chamber. The air was thick with unease, with something unspoken and terrible pressing against the edges of their collective fear. The Supreme Chancellor, an ancient, towering Averin with skin like molten silver, shifted uneasily. "We are under attack," he said finally. The words felt foreign, impossible. "Not by rebels. Not by pirates. This is something else." Grand Admiral Zalvanos of the Vorthian Dominion leaned forward, his reptilian eyes narrow. "Ridiculous. Who dares? No force in the galaxy would challenge us openly." The chamber dimmed. A transmission was incoming, overriding every firewall, every security measure. The council members turned as the image of a man flickered into existence. A human. He stood alone, dressed in midnight black armor, a long coat draped over his broad shoulders. His face was carved from stone, eyes like twin abyssal voids, cold, merciless, utterly inhuman. He radiated power, not in the way of rulers accustomed to giving orders, but in the way of something that had survived, adapted, and become something far beyond comprehension. "I assume you remember us." His voice cut through the chamber like a blade. Silence. A soft chuckle, humorless, dangerous. 100 years ago, you exiled us. You burned our cities. You left our people to die in the abyss. You thought that was the end of us." No one spoke. No one breathed. The man tilted his head. "But we are human. And humans evolve." The transmission flickered, shifting to footage. The council chamber gasped. A fleet unlike anything ever seen, loomed against the void. Ships as black as the spaces between galaxies, moving in complete, unnatural silence. They were massive, but their presence was something else entirely. Something wrong. Even the visuals seemed to resist being captured properly, like the universe itself struggled to comprehend them. A Vorthian battleship appeared on screen, a massive war machine, bristling with weapons that had conquered entire sectors. Then, in an instant, it was gone. Not destroyed. Not broken. Gone. Like it had never existed. "Impossible," someone whispered. "Quite possible," a human said smoothly. "We learned. We adapted. And we returned." The Chancellor clenched his fists. "You cannot defy the Council. We are the architects of order. You are nothing." The words were so sharp, so absolute, that they silenced the chamber instantly. "You were kings in a decaying palace. Lords of dust and stagnation. We are not here to challenge you. We are not here to negotiate." The footage shifted again. A planetary fortress, protected by some of the most impenetrable shields in the galaxy. A flash of black metal. Then nothing. Where the fortress once stood, now there was only absence. A hush fell over the chamber. The human took a slow breath, as if savoring the moment. "I want you to understand something. We are not reclaiming lost territory. We are not seeking revenge. We are not playing your games of power." His eyes burned cold. "We are erasing you." The words struck like a hammer. "You cast us into the void," he continued, his voice steady, sharp, relentless. "And we became it. You thought we were gone. But we were watching, waiting, learning. And now we have returned not to rule. He smiled then, and it was not a human expression. It was something older, something terrifying. But to cleanse. A council member trembled. This is madness. The human's gaze turned to him, like a predator regarding an insect. No. This is justice. Someone else tried to speak, but the Supreme Chancellor raised a trembling hand. He had seen something the others had not. Something in the way this man stood, spoke, existed. This is not war. The Chancellor whispered, barely audible. His voice was hollow, dead. This is extinction. The human's expression did not change. Yes. The transmission cut. For a long, terrible moment, the chamber remained frozen. Then the alarms began. Sirens screamed across every council capital, every military outpost. Reports flooded in, ships vanishing, planets falling silent, defenses that had stood for millennia crumbling as though they had never mattered at all. The Galactic Council had ruled for thousands of years, its grip unbreakable, its order absolute. And now, in the span of a single transmission, that order had shattered. Because humanity had returned. And they were unstoppable. The bridge of the Void Requiem was silent. Not the silence of inactivity, but the silence before destruction, the kind that wrapped itself around the inevitable. The crew stood at attention, watching their leader. Commander Elias Voss gazed out at the Galactic Council's primary fleet, his expression unreadable. Thousands of warships stretched across the void, a vast armada assembled from every major species under the Council's rule. They had come to crush him, to erase humanity's resurgence before it could take root. Voss exhaled slowly. They think numbers will save them. His second-in-command, Captain Adrian Cole, smirked. It's all they've ever known. He turned, voice calm but edged with something lethal. Status of the fleet? Formed and waiting on your word. She glanced at the tactical display. They outnumber us 50-1. A chuckle from the command deck. Someone muttered. Poor bastards. Voss lifted a hand, fingers hovering over the command console. One motion, and the war would begin. The Council's fleet hailed them. The central screen flickered to life, revealing Grand Admiral Zerath Kor, his plated exoskeleton gleaming beneath the dim blue lights of his warship's bridge. His mandibles clicked together, his voice a distorted growl through the transmission. Human! You cannot win this fight. Voss let the moment stretch. That implies this is a fight. Kor's jaw twitched, irritation flashing across his features. We are the might of the Galactic Council. You are an outcast, a relic, a species clinging to old wounds. Humanity's time ended a century ago. Your rebellion will be crushed. Voss smiled. Cold. Sharp. Final. Tell me, Admiral, he said, voice almost conversational. Do you know why your fleets have been disappearing? Kor bristled but said nothing. Voss leaned forward slightly, his eyes unreadable. Because they fought like you. They assumed we were still human. His tone darkened, every word carrying weight. But we are something else now. He cut the transmission. Begin. The Void Armada moved. Ships did not accelerate. They did not engage traditional thrust. They simply were, here one moment, somewhere else the next, as if the universe itself had given up on making sense of them. The Council's warships scrambled, struggling to lock onto targets that should not exist. The first engagement lasted 3 seconds. A Council dreadnought, the Aurelian Wrath, had positioned itself at the fleet's center, a fortress-class warship, designed to withstand planetary sieges. It deployed shields, locked weapons, fired. And then it was gone. No explosion. No debris. No warning. One moment, there was a behemoth of war. The next, there was nothing. The fleet's formation fractured. On board the Void Requiem, Cole studied the readings. The weapon worked. Voss barely nodded. Proceed. A second wave of Council ships opened fire. Beams of antimatter, hyper-accelerated slugs, and quantum-distorting warheads streaked toward the Void Armada. They never arrived. Space bent. The attacks ceased to exist. Across the fleet, panic surged. The Council's most elite warships, engineered across millennia, had no battlefield. A voice cracked through their command channels, Voss's voice, broadcast directly into their systems. You are not fighting a rebellion. You are not fighting an army. You are fighting extinction. 3 more dreadnoughts vanished. Grand Admiral Kor watched in horror as his armada disintegrated, not in fire, but in absence. Entire sections of his fleet no longer existed, and he did not know why. This is impossible, he whispered. His tactical officer's mandibles clacked in pure terror. Sir, they're not destroying us. They're removing us. Kor stared at the battlefield, at the nothing where his ships had been. His breathing was uneven. His mind raced. The human fleet was rewriting the rules of war. This was no rebellion. No uprising. This was erasure. He forced his mind to work. Survival. Retreat. Regroup. All forces, withdraw. On the Void Requiem, Cole raised an eyebrow. They're running. Voss did not smile. No. His voice was absolute. They don't get to leave. The Void Armada moved again. In perfect unison, the black ships converged. They did not pursue. They consumed. A tremor shuddered through Kor's warship. His officers screamed as the screens turned to static. Their engines shut down. Their weapons blinked offline. Then silence. The Void Armada stopped. Kor blinked. His ship was alone. His armada, thousands of warships, the pride of the Galactic Council, was gone. No wreckage. No escape pods. Just gone. A new transmission. Voss's face reappeared, calm, unwavering. You lost the moment you declared war on us. Kor's breast shuddered. What are you? Voss tilted his head slightly. The future. The screen cut out. And then Kor's ship vanished. The silence on the bridge of the Void Requiem was absolute. No one spoke. No one moved. The battlefield that once held the largest fleet in the history of the Galactic Council was now an empty void. Elias Voss exhaled slowly. Not in satisfaction. Not in relief. It was merely another step forward. Another inevitability. Cole's voice was calm, but there was an edge to it. There were survivors. He glanced at her. She brought up the display, 4 ships, smaller than the Council dreadnoughts, but still formidable. They had powered down, broadcasting surrender signals. He studied them for a long moment before speaking. Open a channel. The screen flickered, revealing Admiral Valen of the Tarshir Dominion, her feline-like features strained, but composed. Behind her, officers stared at Voss as if looking at a force of nature rather than a man. She spoke first. You have won. Voss's voice was measured. You say that as if it was ever in question. She did not flinch. You will not accept surrender. He did not answer immediately. He let the weight of that truth settle. No. Valen inhaled. Then why open this channel? Because I want to know something. His eyes darkened, his tone sharpening. How did you see this coming? She hesitated. I don't understand. Yes, you do. He leaned forward slightly. Your forces didn't fight like the rest. You hesitated. You pulled back before the first engagement. You lost fewer ships than any other fleet. Why? A flicker of something crossed her face. Because I read our history. He said nothing. She continued. The Council rewrites everything, but there are fragments, records of species that refuse to conform, civilizations that were removed. She swallowed. And I realized something, Commander. No species has ever survived exile. Her voice grew softer, almost reverent. We didn't just cast you out. We created you. Voss let her words settle. Then, quietly, he asked, Do you fear me? A long silence. Yes. He studied her. Not her words. Her eyes. Then, he made his decision. You will return to the council, he said. You will tell them what happened here. A ripple of shock passed through her officers. Even Cole glanced at him. Valen's eyes narrowed. You're letting us go? He tilted his head. No. I am sending you back. Her breath caught. His voice was iron and certainty. They need to see you. To hear you. To look into the eyes of someone who survived. His expression was unreadable. They need to understand that there are no victories left for them. Valen's voice was barely a whisper. You want them to be afraid. No, he said simply. I want them to know fear is useless. The screen cut. Cole exhaled, shaking her head. You just sent them back with a warning. Voss turned from the display, his gaze distant. No, Cole. He stepped toward the viewport, watching the vast emptiness where the greatest fleet in history had stood. I sent them back with a death sentence. The chamber was suffocating with silence. The Galactic Council was afraid. The remaining High Lords, Admirals, and rulers of the dominant species sat around the massive circular table. Some were whispering, others were motionless, staring at the center where a single figure stood, Admiral Valen. Her uniform was torn, her eyes hollow, her fur matted with sweat. She had been back for less than an hour, yet she already knew no one would believe her. Supreme Chancellor Valker, an ancient Averin with skin like liquid mercury, spoke first. You are telling us, he said carefully, that our greatest fleet, the one we assembled with the full might of the Council, is gone? Valen's voice was cracked, brittle. Not gone. Erased. Grand Admiral Zalvanos, his scales gleaming under the artificial light, leaned forward. You fled, he accused. While the others perished. I was allowed to leave. Her throat tightened as she forced out the truth. Commander Elias Voss wanted me to come back. To tell you. Silence. Then laughter. A low, guttural growl from Lord General Xarath of the Dreckery, his jagged fangs glinting. Allowed you to leave? His voice was contemptuous. So now the humans think themselves gods? Valen did not blink. Yes. Xarath slammed a clawed fist onto the table. Enough of this fear-mongering. Enough of this nonsense. A single fleet is lost, and you expect us to believe this void armada can destroy the might of the entire Galactic Council? A cold whisper left Valen's lips. It already has. The room fell into disorder. Voices rose. Accusations flew. Some demanded a full-scale planetary bombardment of every human colony. Others argued for diplomacy. But beneath the bravado, beneath the rage and the denial, one truth poisoned the air. Humanity had returned, and no one knew how to stop them. The Supreme Chancellor raised a hand. Enough. The room fell silent. His silver eyes locked onto Valen. Tell us exactly what you saw. Her hands clenched. I saw a fleet of ships that do not obey physics. I saw weapons that do not cause destruction, but deletion. I saw an enemy that is not bound by the rules of war. Her voice trembled. I saw the death of everything we have built. The Chancellor exhaled. And what did this Elias Voss say? Her gaze darkened. That there are no victories left for us. Zalvanos spat in disgust. Then he is a fool. This council has ruled for millennia. We command trillions. We control entire systems. They are still just humans. A new voice entered the room. No. They are not. The words sent a ripple through the chamber. A hologram flickered to life, a transmission intercepted, an intrusion into the council's most secure sanctum. The room dimmed as a figure materialized in the center of the table. A man. Elias Voss. He stood motionless, his black uniform pristine, his eyes voids of unreadable intent. His presence was oppressive, something inhuman wrapped in the shape of a man. Someone whispered, Impossible. Voss's gaze swept over the room, the rulers, the admirals, the creatures who had shaped the universe with their laws, their order, their arrogance. You sit there, he said, his voice quiet, unhurried, yet somehow far more dangerous than a battle cry. You sit there believing you still rule. The council remained frozen. But you don't, do you? He took a slow step forward, the hologram flickering as if the universe itself strained against his existence. You sit in your fortress, speaking of war, of control, of conquest. But none of that matters. The room felt smaller. Suffocating. You ask yourselves, how do we fight them? His voice was razor-sharp, cutting through their illusions. But what you refuse to understand is this: there is no war to win. Valen's breath caught in her throat. You think of us as an enemy. That is your second mistake. His expression did not change, but the air grew heavier, colder. Your first mistake was exiling us. Xarath bared his fangs. You. Vasa's voice overpowered him. You did not cast us into the void. His words were slow, deliberate, like a blade being drawn. You created us in it. A silence settled, heavier than the void itself. The Chancellor, to his credit, remained composed. You believe yourselves untouchable, then? Vas tilted his head, almost amused. Untouchable? He let the word linger, his voice barely above a whisper. No. The lights flickered. Then, the screaming began. Throughout the Council's most protected star systems, alarms shrieked. Fleets stationed around their throne worlds reported malfunctions, breaches, ships blinking out of existence. The Supreme Chancellor stiffened. What have you done? Vas smiled. And the chamber's walls cracked. Not physically. Conceptually. The room distorted, as if reality itself struggled to contain what was happening. Cole's voice drifted in from somewhere beyond the transmission, a report, crisp and indifferent. 17 Council strongholds neutralized. Defensive networks disabled. All strategic countermeasures irrelevant. Vasa's tone was calm. I am not here to threaten you. He let the weight of that settle. I am here to tell you what is going to happen. No one moved. The Galactic Council is over. The Supreme Chancellor's face was unreadable. And if we refuse to accept that? Vas exhaled slowly. We are not here to bargain. We are not here to rule. His voice dropped lower, and somehow, became infinite. We are here to end you. The room trembled. The galaxy trembled. Then the transmission cut. And one by one, the stars went dark. The galaxy was burning. Across the core systems, entire fleets crumbled. Worlds that had never known war, that had stood untouched for millennia, fell into silence. The Galactic Council, the architects of civilization, the so-called masters of order, were being erased. On the bridge of the Void Requiem, Elias Voss watched without expression. The war had already been won. Now came the conclusion. Cole's voice broke the silence. We have confirmation. 70% of Council-controlled systems have lost central command. Civilian evacuations are chaotic. Their governors are fleeing. Voss did not look away from the display. Resistance? Scattered. Some fleets still hold out, but their command structure is collapsing. Cole's tone was clinical, detached. We've taken the Council's greatest strength and turned it into a liability. Without their rigid hierarchy, they have no cohesion. No future. A moment passed. Then Voss nodded. Send the final message. A single command. A single transmission. One final statement. Across the remnants of the Council's domain, every active screen, every holofeed, every neural interface lit up. No encryption could stop it. No firewall could block it. The Council's remaining leaders, those who had not fled, who had not surrendered to despair, gathered in what was left of their command chambers. They had nothing left but words, but false hope. Then he appeared. Vasa's image flickered onto every display. No grandeur. No pretense. He stood as he always had, a man who did not speak for humanity. A man who simply was its consequence. His voice was quiet. Final. The Council is dead. The words sent a shudder through the last strongholds of power. He continued. You built your empire on control. On chains. You ruled not through strength, but through stagnation. His voice did not rise. It did not need to. For millennia, you believed yourselves untouchable, unbreakable. You stood as gods before the lesser species, dictating the limits of their existence. He exhaled slowly. And then you exiled us. The weight of the words crushed the void. We could have died in the dark. A pause. We should have. Another. But we are human. And humans are not made for dying. On thousands of conquered planets, civilians watched in silence. Some trembled. Some wept. And some, those who had long resented their masters, began to stand. You believed you were removing a threat. That by casting us out, you were securing your dominance. Voss's expression was unreadable. You never considered that you were creating something you could not control. A flicker on the display. Footage began playing. Not destruction. Not battles. Nothing. Empty space, where once there had been the might of the Galactic Council. Entire fleets, entire armadas, reduced to absence. Not wreckage. Not corpses. Just gone. You ask yourselves now, Voss continued, what you must do to survive. You ask what surrender looks like. What mercy remains. He leaned forward. There is none. Some gasped. Some screamed. Some fell to their knees. Voss was unmoved. We have no interest in ruling. No interest in governing. His gaze swept across the broken rulers of the galaxy. We will not build an empire. The Supreme Chancellor, one of the last remaining, clenched his fists. Then what do you want? He rasped. Voss stared at him for a long moment. Then, softly, to end you. The words stole the air from the chamber. The Supreme Chancellor's breath shuddered. You would burn everything? A long silence. Voss's voice was almost a whisper. No. And then it happened. The power grids of every council world flickered. Ships lost control, their systems shutting down as if the universe itself was rejecting them. Planets, entire civilizations, watched in horror as their skies darkened, as if the stars themselves had turned away. And one by one, the core worlds of the Galactic Council ceased to exist. No fire. No impact. No great final battle. Just nothing. Voss watched as the transmission feed flickered. As the last rulers of the old world vanished, along with the ruins of their empire. No speeches. No celebration. Just silence. A hand on his shoulder. Cole's voice, quiet. It's done. He closed his eyes for a moment. Then nodded. Set course, he said. Cole hesitated. To where? Voss stared at the endless void beyond. The darkness beyond the stars. To whatever comes next. The fleet moved. And behind them, the old world faded into oblivion.